Today, we're talking about the concept of growth PR, how it can help transform not only your communications strategy and the perception of communications and PR in your organization, but also transform your business. Joining me for this webinar are 3 communications leaders who will share their perspectives on growth PR and discuss plays that you can start implementing. We're going to end with Q&A, so please submit your questions throughout the presentation by using the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. First, we have Carly Owens, Public Relations Specialist at Experian, the world's leading global information services company. Among her many areas of focus in her role supporting the company's automotive and marketing services businesses, Carly leads PR measurement in North America. Next, we have Robyn Hannah, a strategic communication advisor and PR consultant with more than 15 years of experience. A Silicon Valley veteran, Robyn sits on the board of directors for the Silicon Valley IABC as the Vice President of Communication and Technology, and she's been named to Business Insider's top 50 people in tech PR. Also joining us is Elizabeth Bassler, Director of Media Communications at ConnectWise, a platform of software and services built for technology solution providers. Elizabeth also has over 15 years of experience in communications and public relations, and before joining ConnectWise almost 4 years ago, she served in various communications roles at SeaWorld Parks and Entertainment for over a decade. And I'm Kelly Byrd, Director of Product Marketing at Onclusive and a former PR pro myself. And for those of you who don't yet know Onclusive, our software empowers PR teams to save time with automation and measure the business impact of their work. So to start today's presentation, 2 things. Number 1, for those of you, of course, who are active on Twitter, we welcome conversation, any commentary, and would love to continue kind of discussing this theme with you. So you can use #GrowthPR. And I also just want to start by acknowledging what a year it's been for public relations. And although PR and communications will always be about telling company and brand stories and managing reputation, the ways of creating, controlling, and amplifying those stories, as well as how and when success is best measured, have undergone some major changes. So what is growth PR? Well, pretty simple. Growth PR connects PR to business growth. And in most organizations, the focus of public relations work is no longer on activities only, but on data-driven, real-time storytelling that helps to manage crises, get ahead of the competition, and accelerate activities that impact the business bottom line. I'd actually love to hear from you about this, Robyn. How has this shift in activity-based PR to growth PR changed your communication strategies and the way you think about your work?
Thanks, Kelly. It's a great question. It's an exciting time to be in PR, but it certainly has come with a lot of challenges. More than ever, I think we have realized that words matter and your messaging matters. And as the Growth PR Playbook points out, we've moved from this world of activity-based PR that was sort of output-oriented into a place of more outcome-oriented. There's certainly a maturity curve there, right? But we know that today we are having these many-to-many conversations with our digital storytelling, which means that we often have different audiences who need to hear different things, and they're saying different things. So we have this many-to-many conversation happening, which means that it's no longer about controlling the message. It's really about harnessing and amplifying the right messages that are being pulled through. So I think, as we move away from pitch the press releases, place certain number of bylines, like these sort of like check the box metrics, to this idea of creating messaging that resonates with our different audiences for different needs, I think we need to consider a couple of things. Like, one, who are those audiences? I've used Onclusive across 3 different companies, and those audiences and the stories that we're telling to them have shifted dramatically across each of them based on the needs, right? So you have to consider, who are your audiences? what do they need to hear from you right now and in the near future? Are those your consumers? Are those your B2B buyers? Is that the investor community? And then you need to think about what stories they need to hear. So we're not only having these many to many conversations, we're having multiple conversations with different narratives with these many to many audiences. And so I think looking at things like which key messages are resonating for that audience based on the outcome that you're trying to drive there. So we have to get to a place, and I think certainly the Onclusive platform has been instrumental for me in doing this, but get to a place where we can see the different buckets of conversations that we need to have. So I often use the key messaging pull through reporting to see are the things that we're saying actually resonating with the right audiences? And if they're not, what are they talking about and how can we optimize? So it becomes less about the performative reporting and more about transformative reporting, right? Like what will help us optimize? So when you've pivoted messaging, right, and you've got new boilerplate and you're rolling it out to your sales force and you've got all your frontline people saying your new messaging, and you've done a whole brand relaunch, you want to actually watch those old messages trend down and the new language trend up, right? And you also, now more than ever, I think really, really critical to recognize it's not just the story we tell about our product, it's the story we tell about our values, right? Many people have gone through the last year having to do layoffs or unstaff, and now they're having to restaff. And so what messaging is resonating around your core values as a company, who you are in the world, your mission or your vision for what you want to do as an organization in the world, and are the right sort of influencers talking about that? Are you getting the earned and owned mix? Are you having the right bloggers talk about you in the right way for hiring, for fundraising, right? And so I think growth PR is about amplifying the right messages, but recognizing that it's not a singular message, right? It's not just, we used to say, okay, what's product market fit? And then test to make sure that our messaging aligns with that core buyer, that core audience. And that's not the world today. We have multiple conversations to juggle. And all of those people are also going to take the words that you're saying and take the messaging that you're putting out there and put their own authentic voice on it and then go to their audiences and say it, right? So you need people to look holistically across the entire landscape of social, of earned, of owned, of bloggers, at places like Clubhouse now, right? Like these conversations are happening everywhere. So the more that you can identify which keywords, which language, which messaging is resonating with the various journalists who are writing about you and the various audiences who are influencing conversations is really key. And we worked really hard as communicators to earn a seat at the table. And so you have to continue to sort of earn that trust internally as you build trust externally. And having data is the only way that we're going to be able to do it well. And it's also really helpful to go back internally and say, hey, I know that this is what we're saying about our product for this specific buyer, but we're seeing that these writers or these trade publications or these conversations are happening and that messaging doesn't work. And so here's what is working, and take that back, because people get really tied to sort of the work that they've done in the past and what has historically worked. And so being able to be really agile in messaging has become paramount, especially over this last year as we've seen things move so quickly, and social media has given power to so many more voices.
Yeah, thank you. The agility, obviously, I think, everyone has had to, for better and worse, like ramp that up over the past year. And, that I really appreciate that framing. That's going to stick with me, from performative measurement. That's really just showing, hey, we got these great placements, hey, thank you for the satellite media tour. Here are all the mentions of the spokespeople and executives. Here are the inclusion of the message, to the transformative level. That's also going to show, okay, and as a result of all of that, as a result of that coverage, the time that, spokespeople spent to prepare and have those conversations, et cetera, here is how it's actually impacting our business. And we'll talk about that a little more throughout the presentation. Thank you, Robyn. So that's actually a perfect parlay that, the methods that we're using to attribute business achievements and even revenue to marketing efforts have given birth to bigger budgets and new skills. But in contrast, up until recently, PR coverage has typically been measured by media outlet audience size. So, for example, if someone garnered coverage for their brand in Forbes, they may have reported the circulation of Forbes as the potential audience that saw that article. And this method of measurement doesn't tie back to the business. And these softer metrics usually don't resonate very much with the C-suite. And as Robyn said, especially after the past year, communicators really, have to think about attributing their success to tangible business outcomes. So Elizabeth, I'd love to hear from you. How do you use data and insights to measure PR and communications to business impact at ConnectWise?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Kelly. So at ConnectWise, we mostly work a lot with trade publications, and our executive team, of course, has their favorites, and then they have their least favorites. So having the data on which media outlets and even which reporters are going to do the most for our business based on the data that the Onclusive platform provides is extremely helpful and impactful for us. Well, executive says, oh, I want to talk to this guy. Okay, you can talk to that guy, but I also need you to talk to these 4 other people, because these guys are going to move the needle for us more than this one alone. Even though you may not like one of these, this is gonna help the business, and being able to show them that with data instead of a gut feeling is extremely helpful to build a strategy for getting your communication messages across. And then one of the other things I really appreciate about all the data that Onclusive provides us is one of my main objectives since I started at ConnectWise was to build out the media landscape that we work with. So to go beyond the trades, because there's so much more we can do. So having the data on the outlets and the reporters is incredibly helpful to build out the plan. And then not only building out the plan, but then seeing the impact that you're having based on the interactions that are taking place on your website after that, initial expansion of the media outlets has been huge to not only help with, agency funding and, increases in funding, but also just showing, like Robyn was saying, getting a place at the table and keeping your place at the table to show, this is what I did. I expanded the media landscape with these very strategic media outlets. This is the result you've seen. This is why the function of PR is so valuable. So, I mean, it's just, I couldn't have done that without Onclusive. So.
Well, and for anyone who is unfamiliar, and of course, thank you for saying that, Elizabeth. What Elizabeth's referring to is what we at Onclusive refer to as PR attribution, right? Attributing public relations work to these business outcomes like, someone reads an article about you and then visits your website so you can see that website traffic. But also the next step of that is, well, once they get to your website, what do? Do they visit certain pages? Do they complete certain actions? And if you have e-commerce, do they view products? Do they add things to the cart? Do they even make a purchase, right? So you can go all the way through to revenue. And I'm very glad to hear, Elizabeth, that that's been helpful for you. And just as a follow-up, I wonder, what has the general response been internally as you've started to show data at that level?
So the response has been great. They've been excited and really interested, since we are a software company, to see how the tool is able to track and show the data. But of course, they're also just over the moon about the results that we're getting. So it's been very positive all the way around.
I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you. So if we think about, making this cyclical, right? You are putting out your first of all, identifying your key messaging. You're putting out the stories that are tied to that. You are gaining some coverage around it. You're measuring that coverage, at any level of impact. And then you're using the information that you get out of that to come back and inform the next strategy. In order to have the most actionable earned and owned media insights, it's really paramount also to collaborate with marketing leadership and determine what metrics and KPIs should be in your integrated marketing and communications dashboard and as a part of your measurement. Connecting the dots between those messages, the PR activities that drove those messages, and ultimately the impact that it has on your business is really paramount for the future success of the practice of PR. Carly, as the leader of PR measurement for Experian in North America, can you give us an example of how these business indicators like the website traffic and the actions that are completed by those visitors as a result of your work have helped to drive your communication strategy and also showcase your success to your executive team?
Absolutely. our team is really fortunate in that we are known for the reputational impact that our work has, and that is appreciated. But especially as the team becomes more integrated with other departments and things like marketing, we do want to move beyond reputational impact and also demonstrate business value. And one of the ways that is most effective are metrics like website traffic and actions completed, because this shows in a tangible way that not only is this media coverage telling our story in a positive way, but it's spurring people to come back to the website and sign up for products or inquire about products. And that has been an incredibly powerful way for us to help tell our story to executives and demonstrate that we go beyond just reputational and also drive business impact as well.
And with the response that you've received from leadership at Experian about, showing that level of measurement and showing that data, has it been important to be, I guess, like consistent in terms of frequency with how often you show that information? Do you think that makes a difference?
Yes, it absolutely makes a difference. Unsurprisingly, we're data-driven in everything we do at Experian, including communications. And so because of that, we do measure on a consistent basis and present those results. Depending on the audience, it could be monthly, quarterly, sometimes annually. It just depends on what the needs are. But by showing that consistency and demonstrating that we are bringing consistent value, that has helped us keep, like the other two have mentioned, keep our seat at the table. And so executives think of the communications team as a strategic resource, not an afterthought.
Yeah, thank you. And that's kind of another important thing to think about, right? It's one thing to gain that quote unquote seat at the table. It's another thing to maintain it, because you keep coming back to that level of leadership with data ongoing to show, what of the, not just as Robyn said, outputs of your work been, like the volumes of coverage, but the outcomes of that, like the impact level of all of that work that you're doing. And the more that people continue to see that, the more not only engaged do they likely get as a result and inquisitive, but also, that makes it a little bit less of a question when it comes time to set budgets and strategies and things like that, in terms of what is the value of the work of communications and PR teams.
And Kelly, I would add there that brand sentiment actually has a bigger impact on business overall than it ever has before. And so while it is really important to know, did we capture the right audience? Did they come to our website and did they take actions that matter for us, right? Not just did they see our name and then come to our website and realize it was totally irrelevant because the publication was actually something totally irrelevant, right? But how people feel about you as a brand, especially in light of cancel culture, and it's a whole separate webinar to argue the pros and cons of cancel culture, but the reality is that we live in this age of purpose and this age of accountability. And so our reputation and how people think about us and the language and the messaging that they are using when they talk about us actually has a really big business impact at the end of the day, right? And so I think balancing those two, like the reputation and then those really clear linear metrics, like did they fill out a contact us form, did they buy a product, did they watch a video, like things like that, where we can kind of put a dollar number on that, but being able to merge those together today is really critical.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Robyn. Absolutely. I mean, being able to measure the brand sentiment of, first of all, not just your brand, but also peers and or competitors out there in the market, and track that over time and see, okay, when you start telling certain stories that, of course, the foundation of which come from specific messaging, does that help to increase your positive brand sentiment? Does that potentially put a negative connotation out there? Are people pretty neutral and, they're not quite sure what to think about it yet? And also, does that also mean that your competitors start to pick up on that and potentially either start to use that messaging or shift their own storytelling as a result of what you're doing? And again, how does that affect their sentiment over time? So thank you for pointing that out. It's important that we're also keeping an eye on those kind of baseline metrics that really can also help to tie back to the reputations or the effect of all of this work on brand reputation.
And I would say too that one of the things about brand sentiment is that's one of those metrics that can be really informative and help you adjust your strategy as well. So going back to the cyclical nature of growth PR, I think when you look at consistency, one of the other benefits of that is that you can refine your strategy. And when you're presenting that consistently, you can even point that out and say, based on what we saw last quarter, this is the adjustments we made, and these are the positive results we saw, which just continues to demonstrate how your team is really being strategic and wanting to make sure there is that business impact as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Carly. So just to break it down before we start to get into Q&A, we'd like to think of this growth PR, if we're thinking of it as a framework, there are 4 pillars. So the first is creating the right message, as we've been talking about, controlling the message, pitching and amplifying that message, and then of course the analysis part, right, of being able to see how all of that comes together. So we just want to briefly discuss each, what they mean for communication strategy, and then just provide what we're calling like a PR play for incorporating each of these pillars into your work. So in starting with creating the right message, of course, we've already had a lot of conversation about this. This is really the most important element to rise above the noise. And communicators need a concise, simple message that every storyteller can support and get behind, and ideally like less than 10 words. And message creation can be a guessing game, right? If you don't have the data, but if you're using data, you're able to test messages, examine the message pull through, as Robyn spoke about earlier, with different core audiences, and also see how those messages perform against your competitors. And a PR play here is testing the messaging and the messages that are important to your brand and determine which of those sound bites, which of those snippets are being included in news articles and blogs, and then amplified across social media and driving that traffic to your website. Robyn, especially as you touched on this before, can you give us some insight into how you have used data to identify the right messages?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, even at Dynamic Signal, most recently, we had gone through a new sort of iteration of how we were describing ourselves, right? When I first started at Dynamic Signal, they were in a very different place versus when I left 4.5 years later, right? And so I see the old messaging and how it no longer resonates with the people that we want to talk to today, right? I think it used to be like mobile first employee advocacy and communication or something. Like it just was very like techie and not right. And we recognized like, okay, our audience make up, our buyers or the users of our products are a different audience, right? And so tweaking the messaging and then watching how it would trend in the platform that we were moving away from mobile first was no longer being captured. And when we introduced messaging that was about creating a connective, engaged, inclusive work environment, those messagings started getting picked up by more and more people and more of the right people. And so we'd start to say like, okay, that was working, the old stuff wasn't working, right? And I did see a question come in about asking about how example of having data on which reporters will give your business the biggest lift. And that's one of the ways that you see the messaging get picked up by certain reporters. And when they are writing, their audiences are engaging on social, they're coming to your website, and you can see what actions they took when you've got the Onclusive platform. And then like that reporter matters for us. So an example is, we got a great write-up in TechCrunch. And, everyone gets excited. It gets tons of engagement on social. But what I saw was that the people that came to our website from TechCrunch weren't taking the actions that were meaningful for us as a company. They would maybe go look to like the team slide, the leadership slide, and see who was on our board, right? But when we were in maybe a trade publication or like Reagan Communication would write about us, or we'd speak at an event, and then people come to our website and they would look at a video and they would click a demo form, right? And they would spend some time on our blog, and we could track all that and know like, hey, if we're in a place right now where we want to attract buyers, then this kind of publication is better. These reporters, when they write about us, we attract those people. If we were in a fundraising cycle, then great. Those TechCrunch articles are what matter to us right now in that moment. But you can kind of tell by which reporters' audiences are coming and taking which actions, whether or not the messaging that was included in that article were aligned with the objectives for your business in the moment now, right? So I think creating the right message for the right audience is all depending on sort of those moving business objectives and goals, and balancing all of the different ways of telling your story digitally and getting the right people to amplify the right part.
No, absolutely, and thank you for sharing that, because this is exactly what we think about when we're saying like growth PR, right? And this whole concept is being considerate of the overall business goals, and just as we do when you're putting together a communication strategy in the first place, right? You're thinking about, okay, who's the audience we're trying to target? What are we talking about? And of course, what are the messages that kind of funnel beneath that? But when you think holistically about all the different storylines you have at any one time, that's when you start to kind of have that more growth mindset of, okay, in the conversation with audience A, maybe we're doing really strongly. We've got a lot of engagement. We know that they love the TechCrunch coverage. They're interested in seeing about our business growth. These are like investor relations, probably type audience. Okay, that we've got kind of a strong drumbeat on. But maybe in some other audiences that are, potentially closer tied to our sales or whatever it is that each company is offering, there's an opportunity for that growth. And so the metrics that you want to measure when we think about this as it relates to, growth PR and this framework will shift as a result of that.
And then even moving beyond that, I saw somebody put in the chat an example of PR activities beyond pitching media. It's really, we have to remember, public relations is not media relations by itself. That is one part of the function and the discipline, right? But once you see that message, that particular message has really resonated with, like, one article is resonating with a particular audience that you care about, then you take that article and that piece and you amplify it across social, and you activate your employees to share it, or you activate your customers to share it, or wherever your sort of communities and champions are. And then they are trusted, and like, they're trusted voices, right? And so then you'll see that they'll attract more people. And so again, kind of controlling the message is really about, I think, harnessing what's working and getting it to the people who are going to amplify it and create this sort of snowball effect. And so it's like, take the thing that works, where the message worked, and then give it to the audience that it matters to, and then they'll create a larger footprint and longer tail for that one piece of coverage. Or again, it works for owned media as well. Not, it could be your blog, or it could be a byline. It's not just article of coverage.
Right, exactly. And that's the perfect parlay into the second pillar about controlling the message. And controlling and distributing messaging, can sometimes be, or used to be, we could say, the most difficult part of the job. Starting with a press release or a pitch to a journalist who could then change the message, and getting attention for the message could be a risky challenge. But just as Robyn mentioned, with owned media, you have control of your message when it's published on your own blog or via a platform like LinkedIn or Medium. And for many brands, owned media is more effective for controlling and distributing news than traditional channels like print, TV, or radio, depending on the objective and the target audience. And a PR play to think about in controlling the message is measuring and analyzing the impact of your own media on a monthly basis, as we talked about before, right? Having that consistency. And this can help not only show you what's working and what's not, but help your leadership and other stakeholders understand how important investing in owned media is to building an audience, and as a result of that, of course, impacting business growth. Carly, I know you've had a lot of success with owned media at Experian, and can you give us an example and a sense of how you've used owned media to control your messaging, and how you measure and report on that, and what results you're seeing?
Definitely. We have a lot of different owned channels at Experian, and we have found that it is one of the most effective ways to make sure that our messaging is getting out there. We've also started using these owned pieces and articles in media relations. So whether we're launching a campaign or just responding to an inquiry, if we can respond with a link to say, yeah, we just talked about this, here's some thoughts that has our expert's point of view, that's always a great first step, even if we end up scheduling an interview after the fact. We've had really great success with this, from entire blog posts being republished in trade publications to seeing expert quotes included in media outlets such as USA Today. And so when you talk about the analysis of your own content too, seeing pickups like this help demonstrate to our leaders that there is value in making sure you spend the time to put those messages on your owned channels. And it shows that owned has been a really effective way to put those messages there, but then that is just a stepping stone to watch those messages spread.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually really impressive to hear that, you've even had a blog post, repurposed for trade publication coverage, right? I think in the beginning, right, when brands first started blogging, which is now quite a long time ago, it was very much just an idea of, giving a little bit of behind the scenes and telling the story. And that still, is important. And I think is a unique opportunity for using your owned media, right? To let people know a little bit more about the workings of the company and the thoughtfulness that you have behind what you do and who's behind that. But also, a lot of reporters are starting to look at companies' blogs and newsrooms as sources at times, either when they're already engaged in conversation with you, for a certain story or a piece, or when they've already seen you publish something and, it's kind of a part of their beat and they want to make sure that they can follow up on that. And so especially when that happens, that's, kind of like a home run in the sense that you have already kind of controlled the content and the publishing, the messaging that's in there, the story being told, the tone of it. And then when it's used externally and validated in that way by a reporter, that's just wonderful.
Another example that we've seen a lot recently is when a CEO puts a letter out, an open letter on your blog, right? So after the violence at the Capitol, CNN and MSNBC, their coverage included screenshots of CEO messages that they had put out on Medium, on their LinkedIn, on your blog, on their Twitter, and they were capturing what companies were saying about these things, right? And so those own channels very much are being amplified more than ever, especially when it's an executive spokesperson or somebody in a position of leadership at your company. So it's super powerful to see how those resonate. And again, back to sort of brand sentiment, and being able to look at when they are picked up, what was the sentiment of the article in the dashboard for Onclusive. You can kind of see the sentiment of the piece. Also, you can say, like, is this resonating well? Is it not? But that one statement that your executive would have put out internally only, like now that we can put them on our blogs and our social channels and Medium and things like that, they're getting picked up all the time because there's more coverage than ever about who brands are and what their leaders are saying and how they're demonstrating their values, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for calling that out, right? That's like some extremely timely examples of where reporters and media in general are kind of going direct to the source to see what leadership at organizations, and even in many cases, employees at organizations are having to say about real-time events that are happening. And again, that kind of goes back to what we talked about in the beginning of thinking about moving from just kind of planned ahead activities to more of that data-driven real-time storytelling that addresses the current state of events and of culture. So for the third of the fourth pillars here, we're thinking about pitching and amplifying that message. And although, of course, there are plenty of journalists to pitch and influencers to target and amplify your messaging, the number of possibilities can sometimes make the task of pitching pretty overwhelming, right? You want to think about who can most effectively amplify my story, who has a voice that resonates with my community, how can I most effectively utilize my time? And fortunately, when you do go back to the data and look at some of those insights about those reporters and about who's already talking about your brand, your industry, your competitors, et cetera, that can help surface the contexts that are most impactful for you. And for a kind of PR play here, we think about examining the publications and the authors that are garnering the most attention and engagement for you, as well as, again, for your competitors. And you can also discover who your biggest advocates are by finding out which influencers are talking about you and not about anyone else, so that you can nurture those relationships. Elizabeth, how are you keeping track of your most impactful publications and authors, and how does that data help you, help influence your work with them and just your communication strategy overall?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So going back to just about a year ago, pandemic was just starting. One of the tools that ConnectWise sells is a remote control software that helps IT professionals get into a computer remotely. So like if your computer is breaking and you call IT and say, hey, something's happening, can you log in and look at it and fix it for me? There are a bunch of other things but that the tool does, but that's a good example. So obviously with everybody rushing home to work remotely, IT teams still had to work on people's computers as they were having problems and they weren't in the office. So our tool, one of our tools, we knew that it was going to be a great solution for people working from home. So we actually, the entire company got behind an entire campaign. Obviously, PR was part of that, where we were talking about the benefits of the remote control tool. We looked at who had written on that previously, who was suddenly writing on it, started pitching them on a variety of content, talking about the various pieces of the software that we have that would help people, like how it could help them work from home more successfully, how it could also help them be secure, because obviously that was an issue of everybody went home with laptops and maybe they're using their home computer, who knows what. But so it was the amount of coverage that we got based on that was just enormous, to the point where, again, Robyn was kind of talking about this earlier, where a lot of companies had to have layoffs. We were also, of course, looking at costs, and my executive asked, hey, do we really need the agency? Is this a monthly cost that we really need to keep going with? And I said, yes, because look at what we've done just in the past month, talking about a tool that we sell. So I showed him a bunch of stats. Again, one of my favorite stats, because it is so impactful with my executives, is the potential customers to our site, and then broke it down and showed them the actions they were taking. Never again was it a question of, do we need the agency? A week later, my executive went on an all hands call and was just raving about the agency, talking about the amount of traction our website had gotten from the earned media efforts and owned as well. And it was just amazing. I mean, I've chill bumps sitting here talking about it. It was amazing. So not only did we show the value, we continued to solidify our seat at the table. And in 2021, our budgets went up. So yay, Onclusive.
Wow.
I can't say enough about how Onclusive has helped me prove the value of the function with data, because we all know it's important, but without the data, you may not convince them. But with this, you can.
Right, exactly. Wow, that's huge. And you've even had budgets increase this year. And I mean, I think that's probably a common question that a lot of people, who are listening in today and who will be watching this recording have had, right? Like, do we really still need to be paying for whatever it is in the, in the budget, whatever these line items are, right? Everyone had to go back and put a little more scrutiny on those decisions, right? Most every business has had to do that in the past 12 months. And no matter where you work in a company, you always need to have some type of proof point to say, well, yeah, I do need to keep that budget. I have it allocated in these ways, and it's really helping us to do our work and to do it successfully and to do it strategically. But again, as a function overall in terms of communications, and even when you do that comparison with marketing, in a lot of organizations, it's more common that the marketing team can come ready with that data, in a 20 minutes request or maybe within a few hours. Whereas, if you're kind of manually cobbling things together, or, you're compiling things from multiple sources around the globe, like every agency partner in every different market, it's going to take a lot longer to be able to put that together successfully. And just in terms of internal communication and presentation, it makes things a little more difficult.
Yeah.
And just with the final kind of pillar here of growth PR, thinking of it as a framework, of course, this whole discussion has been rooted in overall PR measurement. And in doing that, we can analyze how your work impacts your business, and of course, your communications goals and metrics that are tied to reputation and brand awareness, like brand sentiment. And of course, increasingly, just as we've been talking about, CMOs, CEOs, other executives in leadership, they're looking for integrated marketing communications measurement, and they want to see how efforts across paid, earned, shared, and owned media are driving business results. So a critical PR play here is implementing and identifying the right KPIs from the beginning. Know what you're measuring before you even launch a campaign, just as you know who you're targeting, and also know whether you're focused on brand awareness or business consideration and or conversion. And knowing this is going to allow you to select the correct metrics and the correct KPIs and iterate your campaign as needed. So really briefly, before we get into the Q&A, just wanted to outline here some of the best metrics that we've seen in measuring KPI, both for earned and owned media. And as we've been talking about, Onclusive as a company and our software measures the business impact of every single piece of earned, owned, and newswire content for our customers. And so some of the best metrics and KPIs to measure success that we've heard from customers include social amplification, which would be social engagement with your content, share of amplification, social engagement comparison versus your competitors or your peers. Some of those business outcomes we've been talking about that are influenced by media coverage, such as website visitors driven, the interactions completed on your website by those visitors, sales funnel indicators like leads garnered if someone comes to your site and fills out a form, and potentially revenue attributed to those actions. For owned media, you can look at readership, the visitors to your blog content, share of voice, a very common metric, just looking at the quantity of your coverage versus peers or competitors. And then power of voice, which is an Onclusive specific metric. This is looking at the quality of your coverage versus your competitors. So going just beyond the volume. And then lastly, as we've talked a lot about today, message resonance. So the inclusion of your key messages and spokespeople throughout your stories. So, okay, we want to hear from you, and we're going to pop up a poll here in a second and ask you, how important is your measurement strategy to make sure in your organization that your work is really not overlooked? So you should see that poll pop up here, and we'll just give a couple seconds to let everybody answer. Well, this is interesting. I'm seeing a rotation between what's number one and what's number two. I'll give a couple more seconds to let people respond. How important is measurement strategy to make sure in your company that your work's not overlooked, to keep to not just, again, get that seat at the table, but to maintain it? Give it 10 more seconds. I still see some answers coming in. Okay, let's look at the results here. So 49% of you said this is important, but you want more actionable insights, right? Moving on from just having some data and being able to see this, but how do you take that into actions that you can then inform your strategies? 38% said it's really important, you couldn't keep your budget without it. 8% said it's important, but you're not quite sure, where to start. Maybe you're still doing some like manual calculations or using various tools and platforms and different locations. And 5% said it's somewhat important, but you need tools to enable that automation. So thank you for answering that. I want to pause just to see Elizabeth, Robyn, or Carly. Do you have any feedback or kind of response to the results of this poll in general? Does anything in here surprise you before we answer the questions people have submitted in the Q&A function?
I'd say that the idea of PR attribution to business impact and measurement is an evolution, right? And so I just would encourage people who feel like they're not where they want to be on that spectrum, or like they're in one place, but maybe their executive team would answer differently, right? To sort of be patient and continue to find whatever measurement you can now, or even elevate where you're lacking the right data. Like, hey, we could make strategic decisions if we had this information, but we don't. Like, so sometimes if you're in a place where your measurement strategy is just not there yet, even identifying like what you would do if you had a measurement strategy in place is a good way to start to get one, right? Like just sort of acknowledging like, hey, if I had this info, then we could make these decisions, or we could prioritize things better, or whatever it is. But if you're on that sort of lower end of like, it's not important to us yet, or it's not something that has ever really been thought of, that I would encourage you to think about if you had the measurement tools, what you would do and how that would change the way that you allocate time, resources, budget, team, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right, so it's time for Q&A. If anyone hasn't already, I see several questions in here. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom. And I'm going to pose the first question, which was submitted in advance to you, Carly. So this comes from someone who is an employee at a government agency. And they said, as a government agency, we don't have a lot of resources to, to count things, to measure beyond like web stats or social media analytics. So can you please share some other metric ideas that can capture our work and do so more effectively?
Yeah, I absolutely love this question because so often people assume that PR measurement is just that. It's just counts, it's just static numbers, but it's so much more than that. Going beyond and giving some analysis and context to those numbers makes it so much more effective. And I find that the time I spend analyzing coverage and putting that into the deck to give context, that demonstrates the value way more effectively than just a count would. So some of the ways that I do that is I always start by asking myself, what makes an article or whatever you're looking at, what makes it a win? For us, typically that means that it's more than just the Experian name being mentioned. It includes our point of view or a spokesperson quote or something like that. But ultimately, what makes it a win is absolutely dependent on your company and what your goals are. So there's no universal way to decide what a win is. So it's just understanding what's important to your organization. Another way to do that would be to look at the outlet and explain why that outlet and its audience is really important to your organization and how that's going to have more of an impact. Talking about, like, we've talked about, how some people have favorite trades and others that they're not so fond of. But if you're able to explain that this one that maybe isn't their favorite has a more niche audience that is going to be more impactful for you, I think that also demonstrates value. Another way that we do this is looking at layering metrics and bringing in things beyond just count. So we look at, in addition to the actual coverage count, we'll layer in brand sentiment as well. And so this is really informative because if we see that, say, in 1 month, the overall coverage count has gone down, but the positive coverage count has gone up, this is a really powerful way to demonstrate that an overall dip isn't quite so concerning, because we see that the coverage that we did receive that month is painting us in a really positive light and has had more reputational impact than, say, a previous month where most of the coverage was neutral. So those are just some of the ways, but ultimately I think it comes down to asking yourself what matters most and being able to figure out ways to demonstrate that, whether it is a count or just analysis on its own. But ultimately I think counts and analyses brought together is the most effective way to demonstrate value.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you very much, Carly. I'm going to pose the next question to you, Elizabeth. Someone said, do you believe PR can be an effective channel for driving sales? And, do you potentially have any CAC or customer acquisition cost on PR spending as a key metric that you work with, or any other indicator of sales?
So that's another great question. I was actually reading the CAC question and thinking, man, that is such a good idea. We talk about CAC quite a lot for our business as a whole. I don't currently track that, but I'm going to try to start, because I think that would be hugely impactful to show what our spend on our agency and what that translates to for acquisition, where it could, instead of paying who knows how much for demand gen opportunities, who knows how much for PPC, all of that, like, look at what this did and potentially look at the size of the sale. So yeah, I mean, I think that's I've been, not only have I learned, hopefully shared some information with everybody on the webinar, but I've been taking notes about things that I want to do better, hearing Carly and Robyn talk about these things. So, I mean, I've already got like 3 pages of notes that I want to dive into next week.
Well, that's the fun part, right? There's always more we can do. We can always go more in depth. Measurement 2 is iterative, right? And, we might be starting with just looking at like coverage count and share of voice and, kind of volume-based metrics. And then we slowly get to, right? It won't be an immediate dive from kind of tracking coverage in spreadsheets to going all the way to customer acquisition costs. But it's good to think about. Yes, and thank you again for that question. A few people had submitted
Kelly, can
questions.
I just hop in on that really quickly? I just want to caution people, because it is kind of a slippery slope to like try to say like, how does PR spend impact CAC? The public relations as a whole is not just for lead gen or demand gen, right? And so it can be like, if you've ever been in a position where a CEO said, oh, great article, how many leads did it drive? That is the behavior that we have tried to correct. That is the thinking that we've worked really hard to shift people from. And so I would just caution anyone who's looking at these sort of sales metrics and trying to apply them to PR, you're not looking at public relations and PR attribution holistically. And so that might be a nice add-on, like it's a happy outcome, but the function and the discipline of public relations is not just to drive leads and impact CAC, right? So I want to, because we've all worked really hard to be like, yeah, but this many people, like awareness matters, trust matters, brand reputation matters, right? Having people have the right idea about who we are and what we offer matters. And it's not just about, did that person buy, right? So just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I'm gonna throw in two very quick plugs on that. One is that's exactly why we're talking about here, thinking about like integrated communications and marketing measurement.
That's right.
Because there are some things that marketing organizations are responsible for, other metrics that communications are responsible for, but the more that we can kind of connect the two and have that kind of crossover to make it a full line to see that, that's what's going to be helpful, but absolutely. And secondly, just because we're touching on, of course, the importance of reputation, and that's been called out several times, at Onclusive, like we're really proud of our partnership with RepTrack, who used to be known as a Reputation Institute, to also help to kind of make that connection between brand reputation and, all the way through to, not exactly all the way to customer acquisition costs, but getting a little bit closer there so that we can kind of pass that and make that connection to paid forms of marketing.
I mean, even in marketing, who's been looking at attribution data for years now, they struggle, right? Because it's multi-touch, right? Attribution is difficult to pin it to one thing, right? Because the reality is they could have read an article about you, heard one of your executives speak at an event, followed you on social media, and then one day they, after all those things, read an article and then going to your website and subscribing to your blog, one day, 3 months later, they click like learn more on a blog post. And then the blog, the marketing team is like, oh, that blog post drove a customer, but like, that's not really the whole picture. And I think eroding the silos between internal and external communication has been a big challenge that a lot of organizations work to overcome over the last year. The other silos that we really need to work on eroding are the ones between like who gets credit, right? I think it's critical that we say like that we recognize PR attribution in regards to the business impact, but that we share that data and those insights, because we're all working for the benefit of the company and the growth and the employees who are working so hard every day to make it happen. And so it can't be like, this is my data, that's yours. I get credit for this, you get credit for that. And if you're at an organization, and we've all been there, where you feel like you're fighting for credit, like fighting to justify the spend in public relations and brand, and like switch companies. Because you can't have infighting about like who owns what, right? You have to be willing to share the data and share the tools and share the attribution, and not allow PR attribution to be discounted in any way, because it's not a linear thing always that fits into the funnel so perfectly. But to make sure that that is part of the overall blend of data and information that you are providing.
100%, 100%. Yeah, some of our customers take our data and put it in what a lot of organizations call media mix modeling or marketing mix modeling, where they're pulling data from all the tools across comms, across marketing, putting them in one place, and then using that to kind of make some business level decisions about like budget and all of that. So absolutely, right? The more that we have that holistic view, and it's clear that first of all, everyone is kind of telling a consistent story, and all of that is helping, of course, like the end goal of all of this work is to help to drive growth for the business, the better. We have a few minutes, so I'm going to take one quick question that was about Onclusive's capabilities and ask a final one. Someone asked, can we touch about Onclusive's international capabilities and/or ability to track brand sentiment and other metrics in multiple languages? So at Onclusive, we can track coverage full across the globe, and we do have the ability to track brand sentiment in above 100 languages. So just wanted to touch on that. And then I'm going to pose this last question to you, Carly. Someone said, Elizabeth touched on the fact of using data to show and prove the results of PR. And this person said, I work at a large company and also own a small business. And I find it much easier to attribute, my small business PR activities to business results than I do in my day job in the big organization. When you're just one of many functions who are excited to take credit for results like, like storefront brick and mortar marketing, how do you delineate your results from other functions? I'll pose that to you, Carly.
That is a great question. I think it comes down to what we've been talking about how business impact is a great result, but you also want to make sure that people understand PR holistically and looking at the reputational impact of PR. I think that's really what differentiates us. Talking about things like website metrics, super helpful, definitely demonstrates value. But overall, as our team is going to be thought of as reputation driving, and that's what we want. That's the work that we do. And I think doing a deep dive of analysis of like why having this spokesperson quote in this outlet can help demonstrate that. And then we just have things like website traffic that are further proof points of, yeah, not only did this audience read this and that change their perception, or hopefully change their perception of our brand, but it also drove them to the website. So I think also, I love what Robyn said about not having infighting. I think it is also important to realize we're all part of a larger team. We're all working towards the same goals. So if on occasion some other team gets more credit, I know personally I'm not too worried about it, because as long as we're all working towards the same goals, like that's what we want to be worried about.
Well, thank you, Carly, Robyn, and Elizabeth for sharing your thoughts on Growth PR. And thank you all for joining us. We're going to be distributing this recording to all registrants tomorrow and publishing our Growth PR Playbook tomorrow as well. So have a great rest of the day. And if you do have any follow-up questions or would love to see our platform and get into more of what we discussed today, email us info@onclusive.com. Thanks, everybody.